curriculum, or CAC, and it's an honor this week to welcome Brandy Harvey, the Dean of the BELS Division and Professor of English. And Brandy's title is After the Silence, Interdisciplinary Research and Vulnerability.
Some of you know that I wrote about maternal infanticide. My dissertation was about maternal infanticide. So what I'm presenting today is kind of an excerpt from the introduction, which combines creative nonfiction, personal narrative, and scholarly work. Hisei Yamamoto's short story, 17 syllables, tells the story of a mother and her daughter. In this story, the mother maintains two separate identities with two separate names. She is a mother, and she is a poet. She maintains them separately. This story joins a larger conversation about creativity in the maternal, creation of life, creation of identity. These are entangled, but it seems that one must often result in the omission of the other. In Apostrophe, Animation, and Abortion, Barbara Johnson invokes infanticide as a metaphor to define writing by women, noting that it is though male writing were by nature procreative, while female writing is somehow by nature infanticidal. Academic work requires a certain amount of distance, a separation from oneself. Resources and experts and text must occupy the space between our own words and our thoughts. Our theories must be bolstered by the work of others. This protects us, yet this relegates us to the bio paragraph somehow. What happens when we become vulnerable? What happens when we create fiction with theory? What happens when our story becomes intertwined with scholarship? The introduction I'm sharing marks the beginning of my identity as a scholar who found a different path. Pregnant, sitting in a slave narratives class, trying to stay awake, wondering where my keys were. Any of you who have been pregnant can understand that. Stomach growling. I find myself suddenly engaged as the story of Nat Turner awakens me. I wonder, what did women do in a time of male-led violent insurrections? Did women and mothers respond to slavery with violence? Or did they resist silently, as many women have done throughout time and place? Had I been a slave, a woman, and a mother in slavery, what would I have done? Surely I would have done something. Friends, families, neighbors often ask, how do you write about such an awful topic? Colleagues and other scholars even question my devotion. How do you spend so much time studying such a disturbing phenomenon? Both groups are doubly inquisitive when I tell them I was pregnant when I became interested in writing about maternal infanticide. So began my research. Feminist scholars often discuss abortion and infanticide from a cultural perspective, pointing to political and social inequities as the cause of deliberate maternal choices. In Of Woman Born, Adrienne Rich distinguishes infanticide committed as a social statement from infanticide due to circumstance. And she says, throughout history, numberless women have killed children they knew they could not rear, whether economically or emotionally. Children forced on them by rape, ignorance, poverty, marriage, or by the absence of or sanctions against birth control and abortion. These terrible, prevalent acts have to be distinguished from infanticide as deliberate social policy practiced by peoples everywhere against against female, never male, or malformed children, twins, or the firstborn. I would add, the imperfect. While Rich delineates two kinds of infanticide, one purportedly more tolerable than the other, the circumstances under which maternal infanticide is committed have their origin in social injustice. Such distinctions tend to essentialize the infanticidal mother and the act of infanticide itself, as it claims to represent each act as dependent solely upon social forces that may or may not have a bearing on its occurrence. While each literary representation of the act of infanticide speaks to the social and political environment of the community within which it is committed, each act of maternal infanticide also speaks loudly to the particular experience of the mother who commits it. And while Marianne Hirsch is correct in pointing out that maternal discourse is intimately tied to and tied up in social and political reality, as well as biological and psychological structures, the discourse of the mother also reveals simply her personal experience. Thus, the literary text that presents an act of infanticide is an act of representation. If its broad significance emerges from its conversation with its social and political environment, its specificity results from the way it figures the individual experiences of motherhood. The act of maternal infanticide in literature must be read in view of both the cultural background against which it occurs, as well as the experiences and words of the character who commits the act. As a scholar, I was first interested in the historical, cultural, political moment. But as a pregnant woman, I was interested in the story of the mother, the story most often left untold. And if we think about Susan Smith or Andrea Yates or some of the real women, we think about the news reports and what the father said when he's on camera and the detectives. Rarely do we hear the story of the mother. As I began to examine maternal infanticide in literature, I approached the project as my new historicist education had prepared me. Scholar, right? I employed my knowledge of women's literature, feminist theory, as well as historical and cultural scholarship to read the representations of maternal infanticide in literature. This would have featured a discussion of literary representations of women, advice books written for women and mothers, an examination of the ways in which the institution of slavery and class separation informed gender roles. My work would have started with a discussion of the position of the mother in her society. The mother in a patriarchal society faces contradictory mandates and impulses concerning her place. Adrienne Rich articulates this contradiction. Throughout patriarchal mythology, dream symbolism, theology, language, two ideas flow side by side. One, that the female body is impure, corrupt, the site of discharges, bleedings, dangerous to masculinity, a source of moral and physical contamination, the devil's gateway. On the other hand, as mother, the woman is beneficent, sacred, pure, asexual, nourishing. And the physical potential for motherhood, that same body with its bleedings and mysteries, is her single destiny and justification in life. Women are defined through a dichotomy of good and evil, and motherhood signifies the woman's redemption. But this redemption also damns her. In Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva locates power in the duplicitous interpretations of women, as she claims that the theme of the two-faced mother is perhaps the representation of the baleful power women bestow over mortal life. Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, when read through a feminist lens, reveals patriarchy's fear of the reproductive power of women. If you read The Birthmark, read it sometime and consider the idea that the woman is indeed to be feared because of her power to reproduce. Because the mother bears the weight of Eve's transgression as a means to redemption, she is expected to carry the burden of male salvation, taking on the role of Mary, who redeemed the sins of the original mother. In 19th century British literature, the woman's burden involves the respectful bearing of children, along with the maintenance of the home for the comfort of the husband. In American sermons, sentimental novels, and guidebooks of the 19th and early 20th centuries, mothers are reminded of their duty to raise pious and patriotic sons to know full well their civic duty to obey and serve God and their country. Lydia Maria Child dedicates her advice book, The Mother's Book, to American mothers on whose intelligence and discretion the safety and prosperity of our republic so much depend. This dedication not only testifies to the sacred image of the mother in early America, it also reveals the notions of appropriate motherhood so widely held. Therefore, the mother must contend with the idea that while she is considered impure and corrupt, she must lead her sons to salvation. While much of the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries represents the ideal of motherhood, literary representations of infanticide confirm the complexity of the position of the mother. Stephanie Shaw, in her examination of the resistance of slave women, says, Where women engaged directly and indirectly in abortions and infanticide, they picked away at one of the bases of the system's life itself, reproduction. Women's redemption in the patriarchal society lies in maternity and the raising of pious and patriotic, powerful sons. But the power to give and take life also marks her as a threat to this patriarchy. I began to think that this possibility that a woman might choose not to conform to the image of the angel, this fear that a woman might harness her reproductive power, is why so many advice books for mothers have been published. Away from Home, My Own Mother, and the first of my friends to face motherhood, I consulted the book What to Expect When You're Expecting. I'm sure you've seen it on the shelves. A modern advice book. I enjoyed the month-by-month account of the changes my body was experiencing. I avoided the detailed chapter on childbirth and what was bound to happen. I giggled at the section addressing the father feeling left out and repulsed by his wife's new body. And after my first daughter arrived, someone gave me What to Expect the first year. While I was new to the experience of motherhood, I found the advice in this second text somewhat redundant. I really could have figured out most of the particulars in regards to diapering and feeding and things like that. It was through these books, however useful and belittling at the time, that I began to recognize the impact such books might have had on 19th and early 20th century mothers, and even on some of my peers. And I would add that today, bloggers offer a plethora of advice for parenting. Mothers face the contemporary pressure of raising the perfect child perfectly. Somewhat, we've moved a little further into the realm of parenting. She must ensure her son's or her daughter's academic, artistic, athletic success via tutoring, lessons, team sports, etc. I think there's a new term that I've heard frequently, mom shaming, where social media allows for this kind of indirect, passive-aggressive shaming. My child got first place in the track meet and all A's, and this is a new phenomenon we're facing in the realm of parenting. Sadly, the image of the mother as advocated by the popular cultures of the 19th and 20th centuries and today was attainable by few women and tended to alienate those who could not live up to the ideal. The institution of slavery, the denigration of the African people, the problem of class separation and poverty, working conditions, colonization, industrialism, and gender issues all inform the images of motherhood found in the literature of 19th and 20th century Britain and America. Yet the idea of the mother as an angel, as salvific, reigns supreme over the realities faced by most women who mother. Adrienne Rich writes, "Motherhood calls to mind the home." In considering the position of the mother who is marginalized, Laurie Vickroy recognizes the problems associated with the idea of home as espoused by much of this literature, stating, "One indicator of a mother's power is her relationship to home and what this place signifies about her relationship to herself, to her children, and to the social realm, as well as to the traumatic consequences of her inability to provide or maintain a safe home." She goes on to argue that the inability to provide the ideal home illustrates personal traumatic legacies, suggesting that the home can be a place of traumatic history for those without the power to provide for her children according to society's expectations. The image of the maternal in much of this literature, the image that is espoused by society, excludes marginalized mothers, while it also serves as an indicator of their failure or lack of power. The home and the mother as icon became little more than reminders that the mother who is not a member of the accepted class within her society is doomed somehow to become monstrous. She will never be the angel because she cannot provide the salvation that she does not possess. While the image of the maternal has often been employed in literature, both fiction and nonfiction, for its stabilizing presence, the marginal maternal image testifies to the difficulties of remaining stable within a society whose expectations and constraints fail often to consider those outside of the norm. In both American and British literature, the images of the maternal reflect tensions involving race, class, and gender. Thus, literary representations of marginal mothers are indicative of larger historical traumas specific to the culture recreated within the text. When the experience of the woman, the mother, is considered independently of the social and cultural background, the mother who commits infanticide is labeled as evil or crazy, in keeping with the idea that the female is corrupt. And Andrea Yates comes to mind. When you learn more about her background, you learn a little bit more beyond the postpartum depression explanation of the infanticide. Rich notes that instead of recognizing the institutional violence of patriarchal motherhood, society labels those women who finally erupt in violence as psychopathological. The woman who commits infanticide is disregarded as someone who is unable to mother. In Mothering Under Slavery in the Antebellum South, Stephanie Shaw notes that when slave women had abortions, refused to conceive, or committed infanticide in order to protect children from a lifetime of slavery, they often did so in the interest of mothering. And even when they made such decisions without considering the child's future, they made mothering decisions not to mother. When considered in light of the historical and or cultural context of its occurrence, maternal infanticide does not indicate the mother's incapacity to mother, but instead indicts the society within which she commits such an act as complicit in her decision. When considered within the frame of the mother's experience, infanticide often becomes a mothering decision rather than an act of insanity. The slave mother in Elizabeth Barrett Browning's The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point, for example, refuses to grant a long life to her baby boy, who looks just like her master. She fears that he will perpetuate the cycle of rape and abuse she has endured. Whatever the context, these mothers remain marginal, if not in terms of race and class, then at least in terms of their choice to stray from the angelic image of womanhood and the salvific nature of motherhood. While the marginality of literary mothers who commit infanticide was a concern of mine from the beginning of the project, with my own mothering experience, I began to reconsider the position of these mothers. In giving birth, I experienced a phenomenon I never could have imagined, an intensely palpable feeling of isolation. I felt vulnerable. While I share the birthing experience with millions of mothers, I still feel that my personal experience is somehow relegated to the margins. This experience led me to seek birth narratives of friends, other mothers, and I found that many of them share this feeling of isolation in giving birth. Together, we are alone. The mother's perspective becomes lost in the excitement of being. Eventually, I began to relate this back to my scholarly work, asking, if mothers experience marginalization in the event of childbirth, how much further marginalized are mothers who subsequently commit infanticide? While I imagined that I would delineate ways in which race and class serve to define marginalization for the infanticidal mother in literature, I began to note that the narratives that follow infanticide do not speak to race and class as determinants of the mother's decision to act. They're relevant, but they're not primary in the mother's story. What is more compelling is that my work became more focused on the story of the mother. I recognized the significance of the act of infanticide in facilitating the mother's story, bringing this marginal character out of her silent position into one in which she speaks. Without a voice, without many choices, these mothers act in the only realm that gives them power, the giving and taking of life. When authored by women, maternal infanticide in literature points to the power of the female over life and death, while it also emphasizes the power of silence from their silenced position. The silent act of infanticide serves as a vehicle through which the marginal mother can speak. Indeed, the trauma of infanticide necessitates the mother's speech act and results in the assertion of her own voice. maternal infanticide in literature places the experience of the mother firmly in focus and creates the opportunity for the mother's story to be told. In the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries, the repeated representation of infanticidal mothers functions as an effort to locate maternal power. Patriarchy, by relegating women and mothers to the private sphere, locates the only source of maternal power and control over the lives and consequently, the deaths of their children and husbands. We read about, these women who poisoned their husbands often in Victorian England. Infanticidal mothers are thus monstrous because they are willing to commit acts considered taboo. They tamper with the patriarchal line by choosing life and death for the descendants of their respective societies. The literary account of infanticide rewrites the definition of motherhood by figuring a mother who not only exceeds social expectations, but speaks about the act that would seem to disqualify her as a mother. In acting and speaking, these mothers offer alternative representations of motherhood, challenging society's essentialist image of the mother. Finally, the mother's story is told by the mother. As I considered the stories told by infanticidal mothers in literature, I looked more closely at what kind of history forms the context for her narrative. It is the mother's history that became important as I realized that my work was creating an essentialist view by turning mostly to historical and cultural context to read maternal infanticide. Thus, I began to locate the mother's own history in each text as most significant to the narrative emerging from infanticide. While motherhood is experienced by many, not every mother has the same mothering experience, even when she shares race and circumstance with other mothers. A mother's silence in her story must then depend mostly upon her own history. As I began to focus on the narrative offered by infanticidal mothers in literature, I recognized the presence of trauma. Some of this could be identified as historical and cultural trauma, but each literary mother I was studying narrates her own personal trauma. While the silence of women has been taken up as significant by new historicists, silence and narrative serve a distinctive function for the mother who commits infanticide. Through the lens of trauma theory, the narrative of each mother's history reveals the significance of her silence. I began to read trauma theory, an extension of psychoanalytic theory, and found that I could not put it down for reasons that were as personal as they were professional. My first birthing experience had been a traumatic experience that ended after 36 hours with the birth of a perfect daughter through an emergency cesarean section. It was grueling. Anna's heart rate dropped with each contraction. I was scared. No one was listening to my fears. A nurse, a professional, made decisions regarding my childbirth without my consent. I was relegated to the margins and left silent. This nurse used her position of authority to pass judgment on my ability to give birth. She made decisions that put our lives, mine and Anna's, in jeopardy. She turned the anesthesia off. She wielded authority over my becoming a mother. Because of this nurse's judgment of my ability to give birth, I pushed for hours with no result. Each push sent Anna's heart rate plummeting. What a relief it was when we located the physician and he took over. He ordered an emergency cesarean section. I had no choice. The surgery was intense, as I had managed to push my umbilical cord wrapped baby into the birth canal. It took two large men, the doctor and a nurse, to push her back into position for cesarean delivery. My baby girl arrived safely. She was such a chunk. She was a beauty with dark hair. And I asked if I could cry. My second birthing experience was well planned out. I would have a scheduled repeat cesarean section and return home with our second daughter. I was anxious, but I didn't anticipate complications. The work of the doctor was almost finished. My doctor, she looked 12, I swear. She was so young. Her work was almost finished. She was talking me through the delivery, explaining in medical terms. I greatly appreciated, her recognizing that I could understand, her medical terminology. She was explaining in medical terms each action she was taking. She paused. She said, "Brandy, you have a beautiful baby girl. She has a complete unilateral cleft lip. She is perfectly healthy." Again, I asked if I could cry. The pediatrician visited me in recovery, explaining that my baby girl could possibly have a hole in every organ down the right side of her body. I was a hostage to the anesthesia, to the recovery room, to her words. The planned event became traumatic as I became aware that my baby would endure multiple surgeries in the coming years. I fell silent. I couldn't name her for 3 days. Intensified by personal trauma, trauma theory became an important tool in my reading of the traumatic experiences of literary mothers. I began to understand firsthand the silence that follows a traumatic event. My personal experiences forced me to relinquish my hold on a new historicist, the old way, the old scholarship, reading of infanticidal mothers and their narratives. I began to read each literary mother's narrative from her perspective alone, with historical and cultural context serving to inform my understanding of her position within society. Through trauma theory, I focused on her particular historical experience, her story as she tells it. While theories on the repetition of trauma speak mostly to the experience of one who has faced his or her own death, my analysis focuses on the experience of one who has survived the death of a child. More specifically, my study employs trauma theory and to focus on someone who's caused the death of her own child. Although the traumatic experience of maternal infanticide is initiated by the actions of the mother in each text, the mother character is also a victim who faces the death of her child with some degree of helplessness. Each mother represented in the literature I included in my study exhibits symptoms characteristic of victims of trauma in the aftermath of her infanticidal act. How does the mother's dual position as both victim and agent complicate her survival in the aftermath of the traumatic experience of infanticide? Shifting the focus to trauma studies to this act, because trauma studies doesn't really cover this kind of thing, so I shifted the focus. And the narrative subsequent to the act requires an extension of these theories into unexamined territory. The literature I examined suggests that once the mother character has killed a child, she experiences symptoms resembling those PTSD, basically. The first to witness the infanticide, the mother endures a period of silence, referred to as belatedness in theories of trauma, in which the traumatic memory repeats itself until the victim is able to tell a story about it. It is in the repetition of memory that the infanticidal mothers serve as trauma victims, and they find themselves imprisoned by their past. It is only through testimony that these survivors of trauma might discover reprieve from the repetition of traumatic memories. Begin to wonder if this is what that means. If women's writing is somehow infanticidal, she must in some way kill the historical writing to be able to emerge with her own voice. The infanticidal mother in literature often presents a narrative characteristic of testimonials offered by trauma victims in her effort to locate a space within which she can exhibit the only type of mothering available to her. She employs the power seized in the control over living and dying and asserts that power through self-defining narrative in her move from a position of subjection into one in which she claims agency. In such a move, the mother is unable to relinquish her culturally given identity. However, she claims a space in which she exists according to her own conditions. The marginalized mother in literature who commits infanticide is both the agent and the victim of the traumatic moment. The infanticidal mother has a powerful story to tell, and her story emphasizes that all mothers have a story to tell. Perhaps infanticide is a metaphor for the traumatic nature of motherhood. Because these mothers have endured a lifetime of traumatic silence, it is only through trauma that she can speak. In Powers of Horror, Julia Kristeva contemplates the initiation of maternity and asks, like woman giving birth, like agent turning victim. In Kristeva's theory, the birthing mother becomes the victim to the spectacle of giving birth. She recognizes in this moment the contradictory impulses of motherhood, the power in giving life, and the futile desire to control that life once given. What does infanticide say about female authorship, especially as it emerged in the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries? In my reading of the text, infanticide is a necessary act in the formation of a culturally unacceptable identity. Maternal infanticide complicates notions of womanhood and motherhood, breaking down the expectations held for both in mainstream and the marginal. On the surface, maternal infanticide kills the image of woman as solely mother, yet it is in motherhood that she locates the power to act and speak. She alone defines her experience, she alone can tell her story. When motherhood and female authorship resist expectations in infanticide and narrative, two results emerge. The woman is further marginalized according to patriarchal conventions, but also the patriarchy is without the power to control women's reproduction or creation. For the infanticidal mother, the gesture precedes the story, the act necessitates the narrative, and both the act and the language cultivate change in the essentialist expectations. I no longer subscribe to the ideal image of motherhood nor of childhood. My daughters try and they fail. They conform and they contradict. They frustrate me and are a great source of pride. They are my creation, they are my story, and they are perfectly fit.
How old are your daughters?
15 and 12.
Can you tell us some of the background of Andrea Yates?
I don't know a ton. I do know that she and her husband and 5 children
Yeah.
lived in a school bus.
No, wrong one. You're the
No?
wrong one. I
That's
just
the
told
wrong
her
one?
today, she's schizophrenic.
Okay.
After the second, do you remember?
Oh,
no, go
I
ahead.
just taught it
I
today.
thought she was
Go ahead.
diagnosed schizophrenic.
After she killed her children, but after her second child, you guys jump in here, because I need to go too. I teach Andrea, don't you teach Andrea? After her second child, the doctor told her, don't have any more children, you have such severe postpartum depression.
Right.
Don't have it, right? Jump in
Yeah,
anytime.
no, no,
But she and her husband belonged to a church that believed that the more children you have, the more glory you have in heaven. In fact, when she was on trial after drowning her 5 children, he went to the judge and said, I want to have sex with my wife, I don't have any children, and I need to get to heaven. And the judge, thank God, said no. In fact, Vicki Saunders' husband had something to do with that. He was the forensic psychologist that talked me out. Anyway, she was on major antipsychotic medication, but it made her kind of sluggish. It made her kind of, she's got these 5 kids, her husband goes off. So her mother-in-law would come almost every day to help her take care of these 5 children. There were 5 children under the age of 10, so she had, or 8 or something. So she, one day her mother-in-law had a doctor's appointment, so she premeditated, she planned it. But she thought her children were possessed by the devil, and so she thought she was saving them. So anyway, so she got up that morning and she drowned all 5 of them. And she very ceremoniously drowned them and laid them out with sheets, covering with sheets. And then she called the police and said, I've killed my children. And so it was pretty upsetting. Her husband has remarried. He's gone to law school. He is a lawyer in Houston. I know he has remarried, but anyway. She was very, I think, unjustly tried. Here in Texas, we have kind of antiquated laws about guilty by reason of insanity. If you premeditate, it can't be reason of insanity. And if you know right from wrong, and she knew both. So the first trial that she went through, her lawyer very, I think incorrectly, did not try for an insanity plea. And so she was placed in prison where every time she kind of comes out of her drug-induced stupor, she tries to kill herself. But so on appeal with a different lawyer, he did try and won the insanity plea. She was on major antipsychotic medications, and this psychiatrist who was reprimanded for this took her off cold turkey, which is one of the reasons she killed her children. So
She grabbed my attention because, just watching from my home, I would see the lawyer speak and the husband speak and the judge speak, and she was always there. You never heard her say a word. And that's kind of what grabbed my attention about her.
she was highly drugged during the trial. So she was drugged, because when she came out of the drugs, she was trying to commit suicide, so.
And this was in Pasadena, so it was a big
I
thing
know.
local and
Didn't
middle class Pasadena.
Didn't her husband work for NASA at the time? I seem to remember.
Or something like that.
Engineer.
He's an engineer, he's
Yeah.
an attorney now, so it's kind of scary.
Yeah, so for, feminist groups and others are pretty mad that, the Andrea Yates is gonna spend the rest of her life in an institution. Rusty Yates, that's his name. He gets on, with his life just fine. And was he culpable in a lot of this? Yeah, knew his wife shouldn't have been left alone, knew she shouldn't have had more children. But who gets carrying the burden? It's the woman.
I have a question. You make points about the marginalized mother in the patriarchal society.
Right.
Is your strong claim, however, that this is psychoanalytically what happens in the unconscious of all mothers?
Well, what I ended up doing, I was looking at the historical marginalization, the cultural and historical marginalization, and that became less interesting to me somehow. It became just kind of an old argument that had been made over and over again. And what I looked at was not necessarily that this is in the psychology of all mothers, but that kind of turning away from that idea of the essentialist view, that each one has a different story to tell. So I looked at Toni Morrison's Beloved, and I wrote about Setha and the haunting of the child. And really, at the end of it, I end up writing about Paul D., a male character in that, and how this trauma gives him the power to speak. And I write about Sandra Cisneros' Woman Hollering Creek, and think about the urban legend and how cultural stories impact our personal identities in such a way that if we don't narrate our own experience, our identities become completely tied up with the cultural identities. So I don't think that I end up saying that this is something that's psychologically part of the mothering experience. I think that kind of where I went by choosing trauma theory was looking at the individual. And yes, we're talking about literary characters, so we're not talking about individuals, but these serve as something of, like all literature, something that's an example of a cultural moment or a moment in life.
Don't you think that the narratives would be very different if men gave birth? I'm serious. Don't you think the narratives
Well,
would be very different?
absolutely. The work of Sisu, her Writing the Body, is the title of her work that I most like to turn to. And she writes about just the difference in the way men's writing looks and feels versus the way women's writing looks and feels. So yes, just in terms of form, but yes, in content also. I don't think, and I cannot remember the poet, if any of you literary people know, there is a line from a poem that goes through my head frequently. This giving birth, this glistening verb. And it's about the writing process. And I can't imagine a male writing that. So yes, I do think that the narratives would be different if written by men.
But if men gave birth, would the roles be reversed? Would men be men, or would they be the child, the ones that raise the children? So again, it changes the entire narrative. Does it change it to, well, we can't hardly use the words maternal and paternal, because it
Right.
reverses those roles.
I'm just thinking about the childbirth stories.
Yeah.
And you're talking about marginalized. They wouldn't be if men gave birth. I mean, we can tell the difference. What's that guy's name at Texas, University of Texas? There's this guy, Pendergrass. He can read something like a page and tell if a man wrote it or a woman wrote it. Yes, but men use more names, women use more pronouns, women use more, there's actual, he can tell. But I'm saying, I think that the narratives, I think the stories would be different. I don't think they'd feel marginalized.
No.
I think it would change.
Well, there's the old joke that if men gave birth, painkillers in birthing would be mandatory.
That's probably true.
Do you think that most women, I've never given birth, but do you think most women feel very isolated after giving birth. Is that part of postpartum depression?
I don't know. I was kind of talking about this with some of my friends who said I didn't feel that way at all. But at the time, when I was talking with very new mothers, they said, oh, yeah. And I think that temporal space kind of takes care of that. And my husband was right there with me and holding my hand, and he was a huge part of it, but you're the only one who is experiencing it. And if you get too deep thinking about it, it really is. You're giving life to something, and then you're responsible for it. So yes, I have long thought about doing a study collecting birth narratives just to kind of find that.
Well, it reminds me that we always die alone,
Yeah,
no matter how
absolutely.
many people are around us.
That's right. That's right.
Brandy, in your research, did you look into non-Western resources?
This, okay, this was a transatlantic American-British studies type project. Some of the urban legends that precede La Llorona, Woman Hollering Creek, there are a lot of precursors, I guess, to the legend that we have here. And some of them go back to Asian cultures. Some of them, they go back to all different areas of the world. We're not real sure where the origin of that was. And it's about a mother. Do you know the legend of La Llorona? A mother of 2 children, and there's so many variations. There are updated modern versions. Who's her children's father? She's just kind of a local, lower middle class kind of person. And the father is a gallant, important person, and he abandons her. And in order to try to grab his attention, she drowns the children in the river. And she spends eternity wailing and crying for the loss of the children that she's killed. So some of that goes to various other cultures, but that is the only place where I really did research outside of the American and British. I had long conversations with my friend Harvey who is Indian, about some of the legends and the stories in her culture, but they didn't really have a place in what I was doing.
Did you ever see how this relates to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or?
I was looking at the work by Dominic LaCapra, some of the trauma theorists of it was kind of a recent emerging theory when I started working on this.
Yeah, I suppose there's just any number of reasons, and you can look for certain themes, just like any number of reasons why one person may kill another.
Right.
But it is interesting. I was just more in the jealousy side when you said you felt alone, and for months it's all about you, and then it's all about the baby.
Yeah.
So I wonder if jealousy could set in, or
I don't think jealousy ever was part of my thought process, either in the scholarship or in my personal narrative.
Seems like the baby's the payoff. I mean, it's like the present. You like, yeah, it's here. It's the pain time that you do feel alone.
yeah. And in my online class, one of the discussions is for people, what did you experience during delivery and having the baby? What do you wish you would have done, or you wish that you would have known that you didn't know? What would you do differently? Boy, that discussion just comes alive. And yeah, you hear a lot of people that the pain was so bad they disliked their baby for 2 weeks, and things like that just horrify some of the 18-year-olds in that class. They never want to have kids.
The lack of control.
Yes.
The idea that, and maybe if we're going to think about while pregnant, you have complete control. I mean, enough control over your own body. And there's a lack of control once the life is independent. And really, if I were to look back at some of the texts and some of the narratives that the mothers tell, I think it is the lack of control that somehow contributes to this feeling that, you know, this need to empower herself.
I'll have another literary type question. You're familiar with Faulkner's As I Lay Dying?
I haven't read it. I'm from Mississippi, I know.
Oh,
Yes. Familiar.
Well, some
Yes.
others in the room may have read. I
Yes.
think he anticipates in that novel a lot of the psychoanalytic implications that you're bringing up here about birthing.
Mm.
Do you know it? As I
Have
Lay
you read
Dying?
Faulkner?
You might take one.
We need Zimmerman in here, the Faulkner expert.
Well, as you were speaking, I'm teaching Spiritual American Literature, and there are two stories. We have a death count in that class. And there are two separate stories, one by Maxine Hawkinson,
Yes.
and she's from, her ancestry's from China, and then the other is Desiree's Baby,
Yes.
which is about Louisiana
Right.
slave culture,
Right.
and both the mothers in those stories drown their babies and drown with their babies. And
Right.
It's the
What's
ultimate.
the name of the Maxine Hawkins?
No name.
No Name Woman,
Yeah.
that's right.
And both of them, it's an ultimate expression of, I have been rendered powerless, and I'm not going to let this child suffer in this culture. I'm going to decide what happens to this child, not you. And
That's
it's,
right.
but she ends up going with the child in both cases.
Right.
It's really interesting.
And I love No Name Woman because she drowns herself and her child in the
In the
community
well.
well.
Yeah.
So she,
Ooh.
she
statement.
implicates the entire community in the drowning.
And taints the water.
And taints the water, and she can't be a forgotten spirit.
Right.
So
But
that's-
and the female narrator of that story spends she talks about how she tries to reconstruct that mother's story
Yes.
over and over again
Yes.
to try to give her a voice, and she feels powerless to give her voice.
And that cool part where she imagines the mother in the field
Yes.
giving birth, and she imagines that the baby is a girl,
Mhm.
and it couldn't be a male, you know.
Because there's more
it can't-
forgiveness
there's-
for men.
There's more forgiveness for men, and that is a really, really cool story. And it says a lot about childbirth and the place of the mother, and so what happens is she becomes pregnant after her husband has left for
He's been
war.
gone in America for a long time.
Yeah, and so the community begins to judge, her in-laws cast her out, and so there are all kinds of cultural type things going on. It's a good story. And in that one, the mother doesn't get to tell her story.
No.
So her
Her
great niece or
her
niece
great niece does.
tries to recreate the story of the mother, and that's why I didn't include it, because we don't have the mother's words,
Right.
because there's someone else telling her story.
How long ago did you write your dissertation?
2008.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you.